After humiliating me at my graduation, telling me in front of 60 guests that I would never measure up to my brother, my parents didn't even notice when I packed my bags and moved away. They were too busy celebrating their golden child to realize I had quietly slipped out of their lives. Years later, when their perfect facade started to crack, they sent my brother to track me down and investigate what I had been up to. What he uncovered made them panic. I am 30 years old now. I am standing in the expansive living room of my penthouse apartment in Portland, Oregon, watching the heavy rain wash over the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass in my hand holds sparkling water, but it feels infinitely heavier today. On the massive mahogany desk just a few steps behind me sits a thick stack of legal paperwork. It is a finalized merger agreement that officially values the media company I built from absolutely nothing at $7.5 million. My parents, Richard and Margaret, do not know this apartment exists. They do not know about the sprawling company headquarters downtown, the dozens of employees on my payroll, or the quiet, luxurious life I have carved out of the suffocating silence they left me in. For 7 long years, they assumed I was out there somewhere in the world, failing miserably. They genuinely believed I was struggling to keep my head above water, bouncing from one dead-end job to another, just like they always predicted I would. They thought I disappeared because their cruel words finally broke me. They thought I ran away because I was too weak, too fragile to handle the harsh reality of being the lesser son, the eternal disappointment, the pathetic shadow standing next to the blinding, glorious light of my older brother, Christian. But they were wrong. I didn't disappear because I was broken. I disappeared because I finally understood the rules of the twisted game they were playing. It was a game I was never going to win, a board heavily rigged against me from the very start. So I decided to flip the board entirely. My father, a man whose entire sense of self-worth was desperately tied to his corporate title and his carefully curated country club image, once demanded that I pay an emotional price for simply existing in his house. My mother, his silent and willing enforcer, made absolutely sure I knew my lowly place every single day. They demanded that I pay for my existence, but they forgot one crucial, fatal thing. They forgot that when you push someone into the pitch-black shadows and leave them there to survive entirely on their own, they eventually learn how to navigate the dark better than anyone else. I learned how to price things. I learned how to value my time, my energy, and most importantly, my peace of mind. Sending Christian to find me after all these years was the absolute biggest mistake they could have ever made. They sent him out to check on the family failure, hoping to find someone desperate enough to manipulate and use. Instead, he found a ghost who had quietly built an empire while they weren't looking. But to truly understand why his discovery shattered their fragile world, and why I allowed it to happen, we have to go back. Not just to the graduation day, but to the long, suffocating years that made that final escape inevitable. They demanded I pay for my existence, and I did. But now it was their turn to settle the ultimate tab. I was born the middle child in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, right into a perfectly manicured suburban neighborhood where your worth was strictly measured by outward appearances. The greenness of your lawn, the make of the leased cars parked in the driveway, and the bumper stickers proudly announcing which prestigious college your child was attending were the only currencies that mattered. In our house, that bumper sticker and all the pride that came with it belonged exclusively to Christian. The clear, agonizing dividing line in our family didn't magically appear when we were teenagers. It started incredibly early. I vividly remember a specific dinner when I was 8 years old. I had entered a school art contest and won 3rd place out of 50 kids. It was a simple crayon and watercolor drawing of our backyard garden, and it came with a shiny, authentic blue ribbon. I was so incredibly proud I could barely sit still in my chair. I carefully set the dining table exactly how my mother liked it, making sure the silverware was perfectly aligned, and then I brought the ribbon into the dining room, placing it gently next to my plate. My father walked through the front door, slamming it shut behind him, and immediately began loosening his tie. He was in a foul, dark mood. I didn't know it at the time, but he had just missed out on a massive promotion at the bank. He was deeply obsessed with getting that promotion, obsessed with the social status and the extra income it would bring to maintain our fake upper-class lifestyle. He walked into the dining room, and his eyes fell on my prize. He glanced at my blue ribbon for maybe 2 seconds. "That is nice, Julian," he muttered, his tone flat and utterly dismissive, already looking past me. Then, his eyes locked onto Christian, who was sitting quietly across the table. His whole demeanor shifted instantly. The tension visibly left his shoulders, replaced by a warm, eager glow. "Tell your mother about the letter you got in the mail today, son." Christian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was 11, and even back then, he got that awkward, guilty look when my parents elevated him at my direct expense. "I got accepted into the district gifted program," Christian said quietly, almost apologetically. My mother actually gasped out loud, her hands flying to her chest in dramatic delight. My father practically sprinted around the table, pulled Christian out of his chair, and hugged him tightly. "We always knew you were destined for truly great things, Christian. You are going to carry this family's name so far." Then, almost as an annoying afterthought, my father looked over Christian's shoulder and glared at me. "Julian, go finish setting the table. We are hungry." "I already did," I whispered, pointing to the neat rows of forks and knives. But he wasn't listening. The grand celebration had already begun, and I was clearly not invited to participate. The next morning, I woke up early to get a glass of water before school. When I walked into the quiet kitchen, I saw my beautiful drawing sticking out of the trash can. It wasn't even crumpled up by accident. It was just deliberately discarded, lying flat and useless among the wet coffee grounds and cracked eggshells, the shiny blue ribbon still pinned proudly to the corner. That was the exact moment I learned my first real, agonizing lesson about how the world worked. Effort meant absolutely nothing if you were simply the wrong child. A few years later, Christian won first place at the state science fair with a basic, uninspired baking soda volcano. The local paper ran a huge photo of him, holding his plastic trophy, my parents beaming with pride on either side. That very same month, I placed honorable mention at the county fair with a highly complex water purification system using activated carbon. My parents didn't even bother to attend the ceremony. They said they were simply too busy with work. I stopped bringing my achievements home after that day. There was no point in showing gold to people who only wanted to see dirt. By the time Christian turned 19, the gap between us wasn't just an emotional canyon. It was financial, tangible, and incredibly heavy. To celebrate his first successful year of college, my parents threw a massive catered barbecue right in our driveway. The smell of expensive charcoal and roasting meat filled the air as they invited half the neighborhood to bear witness to their parenting success. In the middle of the party, my father clinked his glass loudly, gave a sweeping, boastful speech about hard work, dedication, and family legacy, and tossed Christian the shiny keys to a brand new, dark blue sedan. $18,500, paid in full, right off the dealership lot. This is exactly what happens when you apply yourself and strictly maintain our family's high standards, my father announced loudly, making absolutely sure the wealthy neighbors next door heard every single word. He was compensating, of course. He had been passed over for yet another promotion at the bank that year, and the financial cracks in his high-class facade were starting to show. Buying that expensive car was as much about him desperately proving his worth to the neighborhood as it was about actually rewarding Christian. 3 agonizing months later, I turned 16. There was no neighborhood barbecue. There was no sweeping speech about legacy. There was a cheap sheet cake from the local grocery store, sitting sadly on the kitchen counter. When I cautiously asked about getting a car, or even just a little financial help buying a heavily used one so I could get to work, my mother didn't even bother to look up from her lifestyle magazine. "You can use the old Corolla when it is available, Julian," she said smoothly, flipping a glossy page. The Corolla she was referring to was a 2004 model with a severely dented rear bumper, a missing hubcap, and a side mirror held together by layers of gray duct tape. More importantly, it was almost never actually available. My parents always seemed to need it for errands exactly when my shift started. So I walked, I walked 2.3 miles to my minimum wage part-time job at the local hardware store, 3 times a week, rain, sleet, or shine. I remember the feeling of sitting in the break room, trying to dry my soaking wet shoes with paper towels before clocking in. I didn't complain. Complaining in that house only earned you a long, exhausting lecture about your supposed ingratitude and lack of perspective. Instead, I worked. I took extra, grueling shifts on weekends, sweeping dusty floors and stocking heavy shelves until my back ached. I saved every single paycheck, meticulously cashing them at the bank and stuffing the crisp bills into a large glass mason jar that I kept securely hidden in the darkest back corner of my closet, buried under a pile of old, outgrown winter coats. School was no different from home. My teachers all knew Christian. They all loved Christian. Mr. Harrison, my junior year history teacher, handed back my perfectly scored essay one rainy afternoon, looked me dead in the eye, and let out a long, disappointed sigh. You know, Julian, your brother was president of the debate club and captain of the tennis team when he was exactly your age. You should really try to get more involved. It is a genuine shame not to fully utilize that incredible family potential. I just smiled tightly, took my paper, and walked away without a word. I realized then that to the outside world, I wasn't an individual named Julian. I was just Christian's quiet, disappointing sequel. And my parents did absolutely nothing to correct that false narrative. In fact, they practically wrote it. I learned to keep my head down, to become entirely self-sufficient, and to trust absolutely no one but myself. I was slowly building my own armor, dollar by dollar, quiet moment by quiet moment, preparing for the day I would finally break free. The harsh reality of my situation hit its absolute, undeniable peak when college acceptance letters finally rolled around. Christian, predictably, had gone to a top-tier, incredibly expensive private university. My parents had obsessed over his applications for months. They hired expensive private consultants for his admissions essays, paid for multiple weekend campus tours, and cheerfully wrote checks totaling $55,000 out of pocket so their golden boy could graduate with his bachelor's degree completely debt-free. They constantly talked about his bright future around the dinner table as if he was the sole, anointed heir to some grand, imaginary royal inheritance. When it was my turn to apply to colleges, the atmosphere in the house was entirely different. I applied to 3 state schools because the application fees were lower. I got accepted into all 3. I didn't ask my parents to read my personal essays, knowing they would just heavily criticize my writing. I didn't ask them to tour the campuses with me. When I finally sat down at the kitchen table one evening and quietly told them I had chosen a state university a few hours away, the silence that followed was utterly deafening. My mother didn't smile. She didn't offer a word of congratulations. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her black coffee, set the ceramic mug down on the table, and gave me a look of pure, unadulterated pity. Well, that is a very practical choice, Julian. A state school is perfectly fine for someone with your general aptitude. We cannot all be top-tier, elite material like your brother. It is a good thing that you clearly know your limits. I sat there, staring at her perfectly manicured hands. I wanted to scream until my lungs burned. I wanted to flip the heavy wooden kitchen table and ask her why it was so physically impossible for her to just be proud of me for 5 consecutive seconds. But I swallowed the painful, rising lump in my throat, gave a tight, robotic nod, and walked out of the room without looking back. Over my 4 years of college, my parents contributed exactly $12,000 to my education. That was a mere fraction of what they casually handed Christian without a second thought. To survive, I worked 20 hours a week at the campus library, picking up exhausting night shifts at a greasy diner on the weekends. My clothes perpetually smelled like stale coffee and fried food. I lived on cheap box pasta and instant ramen. I took out massive federal loans, high-interest private loans, whatever paperwork I needed to sign just to keep myself enrolled and a roof over my head. I eventually graduated with a solid grade point average, a versatile degree in digital communications, and an absolutely crushing $82,000 in student loan debt. I was suffocating under the immense financial weight of it before my adult life had even officially begun. Meanwhile, Christian was coasting comfortably through a prestigious law school. His expensive downtown apartment rent fully subsidized by the endless bank of mom and dad. I used to lay awake at night and wonder if they truly realized what they were doing, if they consciously understood the profound, life-altering disparity they had maliciously created between their two sons. But as the long years went on, I realized it wasn't an accident. It wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated strategy. By keeping me constantly struggling, constantly scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel just to survive, they ensured I would never, ever pose a threat to the perfect family narrative they had built. Christian was the glowing success story that validated their entire existence. I was the miserable cautionary tale that made his success look even brighter by comparison. I was learning to be invisible in my own family, but I was also learning that absolute invisibility gives you the ultimate, unmatched freedom to observe everything. May of 2017, the day I officially graduated from college. The ceremony was agonizingly long, incredibly crowded, and uncomfortably hot. Out of thousands of sweating students, I walked across the massive stage, grabbed my hard-earned diploma, and quickly scanned the massive sea of faces in the crowd. I eventually found them sitting in the middle rows. My father was staring down, actively scrolling through his phone. My mother was frantically digging through her large designer purse. Neither of them even looked up to see me walk. Only Christian, sitting next to them in a tailored suit, offered a brief, half-hearted wave. Later that evening, my parents hosted a celebratory dinner at a nice, upscale Italian restaurant back in our hometown. They had reserved a large private dining room for 60 guests, extended family members, their wealthy friends from the local country club, people I barely even recognized. They paid for the entire evening, which I foolishly, naively thought meant something. I actually thought, just for one single night, the focus would be on the undeniable fact that I had survived for grueling years and earned my degree against all odds. I was dead wrong. I sat banished at a small side table with two distant cousins who spent the entire 2-hour dinner silently texting on their phones. Christian, of course, sat right at the head table, flanked by my beaming parents. Halfway through the expensive main course, my father stood up, grabbed his crystal wine glass, and tapped it loudly with a silver fork. The noisy room instantly went completely silent. "I want to sincerely thank everyone for coming out today." My father's voice boomed, loud, authoritative, and clearly rehearsed. He smiled warmly at the crowd. "Today, we gather to celebrate achievement, dedication, and the bright future of this family." He then turned his entire body away from me, facing my brother. "Our wonderful son, Christian, has just formally accepted a highly coveted associate position at one of the most prestigious law firms in the entire state. We simply could not be any prouder of the brilliant man he has become." The room immediately erupted in thunderous applause. People raised their expensive wine glasses in his direction. Christian looked down, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. My father let the applause wash over him for a long moment, visibly soaking in the glorious reflected status. Then, as the room finally quieted down, he slowly turned his gaze toward my dark corner of the room. "And Julian graduated today, too," he said. The joyful tone shifted instantly, losing absolutely all its warmth, dropping into a cold, obligatory register. He paused, letting a heavy, deeply uncomfortable silence hang in the air for several agonizing seconds. He looked right at me, a tight, incredibly patronizing smirk forming on his face. "Julian, maybe one day you will finally find something you are actually good at." Laughter. Genuine, rolling, uninhibited laughter erupted from my own family members and their friends. I sat there, completely frozen in my chair, as 60 people openly chuckled at my direct expense. My mother simply smiled and nodded along, taking a polite, elegant sip of her red wine. It wasn't just a bad joke to them. It was an established, accepted fact. I was nothing more than the family punchline. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting heavily in my lap, and I meticulously memorized the face of every single person in that room who laughed. I let a profound, icy coldness wash over my entire body, permanently freezing over whatever pathetic, lingering hope I had left for these people. I left the restaurant an hour later, slipping quietly out through the kitchen side door. No one noticed my absence. I walked back to my empty, dark apartment, meticulously packed 2 suitcases with everything I owned of any value, and opened my laptop. I systematically deleted my old social media and created a new, completely untraceable email address. Then, I booked a one-way bus ticket to Seattle. The next morning, hours before the sun even thought about coming up, I left. I didn't leave a note. I just vanished into thin air. Seattle was bitterly cold, perpetually gray, and completely, wonderfully indifferent to my existence, which was exactly what I desperately needed. Nobody in this sprawling city knew my real name. Nobody compared my face to a golden, perfect older brother. Nobody expected me to fail because nobody expected anything from me at all. I found a tiny, run-down studio apartment in a cheap, noisy neighborhood. Paying the first and last month's rent took almost all of my remaining, desperately hoarded cash. The place was so unbelievably small I could physically touch the kitchen stove while sitting cross-legged on my cheap mattress on the floor. I took the last few $100s I had to my name and bought basic, thick soundproofing foam panels, carefully taping them to the inside walls of the narrow hallway closet. I set up my old college laptop, a cheap USB microphone, and a wobbly chair, creating a makeshift claustrophobic recording and editing booth right there among my hanging shirts. I created a professional profile online under the new alias J.S. Hayes. Julian, the family disappointment, was officially dead. J.S. Hayes, the audio professional, was born. I started aggressively offering freelance audio editing services, cleaning up messy podcasts, editing long audiobooks, balancing complex sound files for independent digital creators. I charged barely anything at first, practically working for free, just to gather 5-star reviews and build a portfolio. Those first few months were absolutely brutal, a masterclass in sheer endurance. I worked 14 hours a day, staring at jagged digital sound waves on my glowing screen until my eyes burned and watered. I ate cheap packets of ramen noodles for dinner 5 nights a week. I didn't go out to bars. I didn't try to make friends. Every single ounce of my physical and mental energy went into pure survival and aggressively paying down that massive, terrifying $82,000 student debt that constantly hung over my neck like a sharpened guillotine. Through all of this, my parents never reached out. They never called the local police to file a missing persons report. They sent exactly one brief text message a week after graduation asking if I had cleared my things out of my college apartment to avoid a fine. And when I replied with a simple yes, that was the end of our communication. They didn't ask where I went. They didn't ask if I was safe. They just let me drift away into the ocean, completely unbothered. But out of that intense, grinding isolation, something truly incredible started to happen. By December of my very first grueling year in Seattle, I miraculously landed a massive, ongoing contract with a highly popular true crime podcast network. I woke up, looked at my banking app one rainy morning, and saw a direct deposit for $3,500. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes. It was the absolute most money I had ever earned in a single month in my entire life. I walked out of my cramped apartment, bought a single, wildly overpriced slice of artisan pizza from a fancy shop down the street, and sat alone on a wet park bench in the freezing, relentless drizzle to eat it. I was completely alone, shivering in a cheap jacket, eating pizza out of a soggy cardboard box, and I had never felt happier or more powerful. I was finally free. I was laying the bricks of an impenetrable fortress, and I swore to myself right then and there that I would never, ever let anyone tear it down. That hard-won peace lasted exactly 10 months. It was March of 2018. It was nearly midnight on a quiet Tuesday, and I was deep into an editing session when my cell phone buzzed violently on my desk. I didn't recognize the incoming number, but the area code flashing on the screen was Pennsylvania. Against my better judgment, a cold, familiar knot instantly forming tight in the pit of my stomach, I hit accept and answered. Julian? Thank God. Thank God you picked up. It was my father. His voice was shaking, utterly panicked, sounding 20 years older than I remembered. I could hear my mother crying softly, a high-pitched, distressed sound in the background. That sound sent a massive jolt of pure, terrifying adrenaline straight through my nervous system. Dad? What is wrong? I asked, immediately standing up from my desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. It is Christian, he stammered, his breath catching heavily in the receiver. Julian, he is in terrible, terrible trouble. He made a massive mistake at the law firm. A huge, reckless mistake with a very important client's trust account. They are initiating severe legal proceedings against him as we speak. If this goes to a public court, he will be instantly disbarred. He will go to federal prison, Julian. His entire life, his career, it will all be completely over. The room around me began to spin. Christian, the perfect son, the flawless lawyer, facing federal prison? What does he need? What is happening? I asked, my voice tight and strained. We need $15,000 to settle it quietly out of court tomorrow morning, my father said, his tone rapidly shifting from helpless panic to absolute, aggressive desperation. We tapped out all our savings trying to cover the initial firm fines. We have absolutely nothing left to give. We know you have been working out there. You are single, you have no real overhead. Julian, he is your flesh and blood brother. This scandal will destroy him forever. What kind of heartless person are you if you sit back and let your own brother go to federal prison over a little bit of money? He knew precisely what emotional buttons to push. He expertly bypassed all logic and went straight for the jugular of guilt, violently twisting the rusty knife of family obligation. I looked at my banking app open on my second monitor. Through grueling, endless work and eating nothing but rice and beans for nearly a year, I had managed to save exactly $15,400. It was my entire hard-earned emergency fund. It was the only thing standing between me and utter homelessness if my freelance work suddenly dried up. Dad, that is literally everything I have to my name, I whispered, feeling the deeply familiar, sickening sensation of being trapped in a corner. Julian, I am begging you, please. My mother's voice broken loudly on the speakerphone, weeping openly and hysterically now. Please, please save your brother. We will pay you back every single cent. We swear to God Almighty. We will take out a bank loan next month. Just wire the money tomorrow morning. Please don't let them take him away. Despite everything, despite the graduation humiliation, the years of neglect, the constant, grinding emotional abuse, they were still my family. The terrifying thought of Christian sitting in a cold jail cell broke something deep inside me. The human compassion they had tried so incredibly hard to starve out of me was somehow still alive. Okay, I said, closing my eyes, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. Text me the bank routing number. I will send it first thing in the morning. The immense relief on their end was palpable, almost suffocating. They thanked me profusely, swearing on their lives the money would be back in my account within 30 days. The next morning, my hands physically shook as I stood at the teller window in the bank and signed the paperwork to authorize the wire transfer. $15,000 instantly gone. I walked out of the bank with exactly $400 to my name, terrifyingly close to zero, but foolishly believing I had just saved my family from destruction. For the first few days immediately after sending the massive wire transfer, I actually felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of purpose. Maybe this was the ultimate turning point we needed. Maybe stepping up to the plate and saving Christian's life and career would finally, permanently earn me a respected seat at the family table. I thought the dynamic had shifted. I thought I mattered. 3 agonizing days after the bank transfer officially cleared, I picked up my phone and sent a quick, anxious text to my father. Did the settlement go through okay? Is Christian safe from the charges? I watched the screen. The text bubble turned bright green. Delivered as a standard SMS. Not an iPhone red receipt. Not a reassuring blue bubble. I frowned. A prickle of unease hitting my neck. But I logically figured he was just out of cell service or his phone was dead. I patiently waited another full 24 hours. I called his primary number. It rang exactly one single time before going straight to a generic, automated carrier voicemail. I immediately called my mother's cell. One short ring, then voicemail. A slow, sickening, freezing dread started to pool deep in my gut. I frantically typed a text to Christian. "Hey, Dad said things got really bad. Checking in. Are you okay?" Green bubble. Silence. Over the next agonizing week, they didn't block me completely right away. No, they were much more calculated than that. They played a horrific psychological game. Whenever I somehow managed to get my mother on the phone by calling from a blocked caller ID, she would answer sounding breathlessly annoyed and put upon. "Julian, we are under immense, crushing psychological pressure right now. Stop harassing us with these constant calls. The legal proceedings are incredibly sensitive and confidential. We will call you when we have actual news to share." Click. The line would go dead. They systematically ghosted me. They weaponized the pretense of intense legal stress to slowly, deliberately back away, stringing me along for 2 agonizing weeks until finally, the hammer dropped. Every single number, my father's, my mother's, and Christian's, was permanently disconnected or strictly blocked from my end. I couldn't reach them if my life depended on it. I sat on the hard floor of my closet, staring blankly at the dark gray soundproofing foam, and let the crushing reality completely wash over me. The money was never coming back. There was no 30-day bank loan. They had ruthlessly taken every single cent I had bled for, exploited my lingering love for my brother, and then violently slammed the heavy iron door directly in my face. The loud, screaming grief I expected didn't come. What came instead was a profound, icy, terrifying clarity. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I calmly stood up, opened my laptop, went to my desktop screen, and created a brand new, empty folder. I slowly typed the name, Insurance. Inside that specific folder, I meticulously saved the official wire transfer confirmation PDF from the bank. I took screenshots of the unanswered green text bubbles. I exported the detailed call logs showing my dozens of desperate attempts to reach them. I downloaded the audio file of my mother's breathless, dismissive voicemail. I didn't know exactly when or how I would need it, but I knew with absolute, chilling certainty that people who lie and steal with such ease always, inevitably come back to the well when they get thirsty again. I shut the laptop with a soft click. That was the exact day the very last remaining shred of Julian, the hopeful, desperate to please son, officially died. I went back to my desk. I doubled my freelance rates. I slept a maximum of 4 hours a night. I aggressively funneled all my burning rage, all my toxic betrayal, into the only single thing in this world that couldn't actively abandon me, my business. Years passed in a blur of relentless, grinding work. The calendar pages flipped rapidly from 2018 to 2021, and then steadily to 2023. In that substantial chunk of time, J.S. Hayes stopped being just a solitary freelance alias and transformed into a highly profitable LLC. I hired a dedicated remote team. We aggressively expanded our services, moving from simply editing basic podcasts to producing massive original audio dramas, narrating best-selling audiobooks for major publishers, and providing high-end, complex sound engineering for independent films. I moved away from the rainy gloom of Seattle down to Portland, Oregon, upgrading from a claustrophobic closet booth to a proper, state-of-the-art commercial studio, and eventually moving myself into a beautiful penthouse apartment overlooking the winding Willamette River. That terrifying $82,000 student debt was paid off in full. The checking account that once held a pathetic $400 now comfortably held 7 figures. But my face was absolutely nowhere on the internet. I handled all major client meetings using advanced AI voice modulators or simply kept my camera turned off, strictly citing corporate privacy reasons. I successfully built an impenetrable fortress of complete anonymity. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, the ugly ghost of my past knocked loudly on the door. It all started with a simple notification. A LinkedIn direct message sent to an old, dormant, long-forgotten account under my real name that I hadn't checked in over 5 years. It was a message from my older cousin, Luke. "Hey Julian, long time no see, man. The family was just talking about you the other day at dinner. Hope you are doing well. Where are you living these days? We should definitely grab a beer sometime soon." I sat frozen in my expensive leather office chair, staring at the glowing screen, my heart rate spiking violently for the first time in years. Luke and I hadn't spoken a single word to each other since high school graduation. He was Christian's fiercely loyal best friend. He didn't care about grabbing a beer with me. This wasn't a friendly catch-up. This was a highly calculated fishing expedition. I replied quickly with a carefully crafted, polite nothing of a message. "Hey Luke, doing well. Traveling a lot for work these days, mostly overseas. Hope everyone back home is good." He pushed back almost immediately, the typing indicator flashing rapidly. "Oh wow, what kind of work? Dad mentioned you were into computers or something. Do you have a good cell number I can call?" I didn't reply. I closed the browser window. My survival instincts, violently honed by years of hypervigilance, were screaming at me like air raid sirens. They were actively looking for me. But why now? After 7 years of absolute, undisturbed silence, why did they suddenly care about my exact whereabouts? You don't send a scout into the woods unless you are desperately looking for resources to harvest. I didn't wait around to find out their endgame. I immediately picked up my encrypted phone and called Carter. Carter was the ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney I had kept firmly on heavy retainer ever since my company hit its very first million in revenue. Carter was a man who only spoke in billable hours, ironclad contracts, and legal threats, and he was fiercely, aggressively loyal to me and my business. "Carter," I said, standing up and staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment at the Portland skyline. "I need you to run a very quiet, very deep background check on my immediate family back in Pennsylvania. Richard and Margaret and my older brother, Christian. Find out exactly what kind of deep financial trouble they are currently drowning in. Somebody is shaking the trees, and I need to know exactly what kind of garbage is going to fall out before it hits the ground. Consider it done by tomorrow morning," Carter said smoothly, the sound of his keyboard already clacking in the background. I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. The storm was coming. I could physically feel the heavy change in the air pressure. But this time, I wasn't a broke, terrified 16-year-old walking in the cold rain, and I wasn't a desperate, naive 20-something wiring his very last dime to save a phantom. This time, I owned the weather, and I was fully prepared to let it rain. By July of 2025, my company had reached a level of success that even I had trouble comprehending. J.S. Hayes Audio Network was pulling in $2.8 million in annual revenue. We had 85,000 dedicated paid subscribers on our premium platform. We owned the exclusive rights to over 300 audiobooks and produced 6 original, highly acclaimed podcast shows. I was not just surviving anymore. I was a major player in the independent media landscape, and the big fish were starting to circle. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my attorney, Carter, called me with the news. Cascade Media Group, a massive international conglomerate, wanted to buy a 65% controlling stake in my company. They had been watching our growth metrics for over a year. The offer on the table was staggering. They valued the company at $7.5 million. They are offering $6.5 million in cash up front, Carter said, his usually stoic voice carrying a rare hint of genuine excitement. You would retain 35% equity and stay on as the creative director with a guaranteed 3-year contract. Your annual salary would be $185,000, plus performance bonuses. Julian, this is life-changing money. This is the kind of deal that means you never have to look at a price tag again for the rest of your life. I walked over to the massive windows of my penthouse and looked out at the sprawling city of Portland. The sky was a heavy, overcast gray, pouring rain down onto the streets below. It was the exact kind of gloomy, oppressive weather that used to make me feel so incredibly small and hopeless when I first arrived on the West Coast. But now it just felt peaceful. Felt like a quiet victory. "Start the paperwork," I told Carter, my voice perfectly steady. "I am ready to sign." The moment I signed the initial term sheet, the grueling process of corporate due diligence began immediately. Cascade Media Group needed to verify every single contract, every financial spreadsheet, and every piece of intellectual property we owned. It was a massive, incredibly tedious legal undertaking, and it required everything to be reviewed by their primary external corporate law firm based up in Seattle. I didn't know it at the time, but sending my highly classified corporate documents to that specific law firm was the exact moment the carefully constructed walls of my anonymous life began to crack. While I was busy preparing for the biggest financial milestone of my life, Carter's private investigator finished the deep background check on my family back in Pennsylvania. The detailed report Carter handed me was absolutely sickening. My parents were not just experiencing a little bit of financial stress. They were completely, hopelessly drowning. My father had been quietly fired from the bank 2 years ago. He never got that coveted promotion he had obsessed over for decades. Instead, he was caught gambling on company time. The country club membership was gone. The fake upper-class facade had completely crumbled. My parents had secretly refinanced their house 3 separate times, completely wiping out any imaginary inheritance they constantly bragged about passing down to Christian. "It gets worse," Carter said, leaning across my desk. "Your father has a severe gambling addiction. Casinos, illegal sports betting rings, high-stakes poker. He owes private collectors an estimated $100,000. They are in so much debt they are about to lose the house entirely." That explained why Luke had suddenly reached out to me on social media. They were desperately hunting for a lifeline, and they weren't just using family members to fish for information. Carter's report revealed that my parents had scraped together $850 to hire a cheap, sleazy private investigator named Wyatt to track me down. Wyatt was sloppy. He had been making calls to my lower-level employees, pretending to be an industry journalist writing a profile on the elusive founder of J.S. Hayes Audio Network. He was aggressively digging for my real name and my physical address. But my father didn't stop there. Knowing that Wyatt was moving too slowly, my father decided to manipulate his golden child. He called Christian, sobbing and playing the victim card perfectly. He fed Christian a completely fabricated story, claiming that I was involved in shady, illegal business practices on the West Coast. He begged Christian to use his high-level access at the Seattle law firm to secretly run my name through their corporate databases, just to make sure I wasn't facing any severe legal proceedings that could somehow blow back and ruin the family name. My father knew exactly what he was doing. He was weaponizing Christian's legal resources to find my money. He just didn't realize that Christian was about to stumble right into the absolute biggest corporate merger of the year. The collision course was set, and there was absolutely no turning back. It was a Thursday afternoon in Seattle. Christian, now a mid-level associate grinding through 70-hour work weeks at his prestigious law firm, was handed a massive stack of files by a senior partner. It was the due diligence paperwork for Cascade Media Group's latest acquisition target, an independent company called J.S. Hayes Audio Network. Christian sat at his desk, drinking stale coffee, mindlessly flipping through the dry incorporation documents. He read the registered business address, a commercial suite in downtown Portland, Oregon. Then he flipped to the founder's executive summary. The official legal name of the sole proprietor and CEO was listed in bold ink: Julian Sarah Hayes. Christian later told me that his heart physically stopped beating for several seconds. He stared at the name. He looked at the staggering $7.5 million corporate valuation. He cross-referenced the birth date on the background check forms. It was an exact match. The elusive, wildly successful millionaire entrepreneur that his firm was investigating wasn't a stranger. It was his little brother. The same brother his parents claimed was a complete failure, living a miserable, pathetic life somewhere in the gutter. Christian didn't even tell his boss he was leaving. He grabbed his car keys, walked straight out of his office, and drove the 3 hours down the highway from Seattle to Portland in a state of absolute, mind-numbing shock. I was making a cup of black coffee in my kitchen when the heavy security buzzer for my penthouse rang. I walked over to the intercom monitor and looked at the video feed. Standing there, soaking wet from the pouring rain, looking pale and completely bewildered, was Christian. I pressed the button to unlock the lobby doors. 5 minutes later, there was a heavy knock on my front door. I opened it slowly. We stood there for a long time, just staring at each other. Christian looked exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his expensive suit was completely soaked through. He looked past me, his eyes widening as he took in the sheer size and luxury of the penthouse apartment. "Julian," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "You built this? You are J.S. Hayes? They are buying your company for millions of dollars. And you didn't tell us? You just let Mom and Dad think you were out there starving." I didn't step aside to let him in. I stood my ground, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Why are you here, Christian? Mom and Dad are terrified," he said, his voice rising with defensive anger. "Dad told me you might be in trouble, that you were facing legal proceedings. He begged me to look you up. And then I see this. You have all this money, and you just cut us off? You completely abandoned your family when they are struggling." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "I abandoned the family? Is that the bedtime story they tell you now? You stopped answering our calls 7 years ago," Christian yelled, finally snapping. "You just vanished. I changed my number because you blocked me," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, icy calm. "I changed my number because I gave you my last $15,000 to keep you out of federal prison. And 3 days later, all of you completely erased me from existence." Christian froze. All the color drained from his face. "What are you talking about? What $15,000? What prison?" I stared at my brother. His confusion was entirely genuine. His eyes were wide, darting back and forth, trying to process what I had just said. He wasn't acting. He genuinely had no idea what I was talking about. "Come inside," I said, stepping back and leaving the door open. Christian walked slowly into the living room, looking completely lost. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and clicked on the folder labeled Insurance. I turned the screen around so it was facing him. "March of 2018, I said, my voice clinical and detached. "Dad called me at midnight. He was crying. Mom was crying. He told me you made a massive, illegal mistake with a client's trust account. He said the firm was pressing charges, that you were facing severe legal proceedings, and you were going to be disbarred and sent to federal prison if you didn't settle out of court immediately." Christian's mouth fell open. "Julian, no. I have never been accused of mishandling funds. I have never faced a disciplinary hearing. My legal record is spotless. I was never going to prison." I reached out and double-clicked the first file. It was the PDF receipt from my bank. "This is the wire transfer. $15,000. It was every single cent I had to my name. I lived on ramen noodles for a year to save that money, and I sent it to Dad's account the very next morning to save your career." Christian stared at the digital receipt, his hands beginning to physically tremble. I clicked the next file. 3 days later, I texted to ask if you were safe. Green bubbles. I called Dad. Voicemail. I called Mom. Voicemail. I called you. "I never got a call from you," Christian whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "My phone never rang. Julian, they told me you got a new job overseas and said you wanted nothing to do with us. They told me you demanded we never contact you again." I played the audio file. My mother's breathless, annoyed voice filled the quiet penthouse. "Julian, we are under immense psychological pressure right now. Stop harassing us." Christian covered his mouth with his hand. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the sofa, and collapsed onto the cushions. The realization of what our parents had done was washing over him like a tidal wave. They had used his name, his pristine reputation, and his hypothetical freedom as a weapon to completely drain my bank account. They had manufactured a life-or-death crisis to steal the only security I had in the world. They used me, Christian sobbed, burying his face in his hands. They used me to rob you, and I didn't even know. Oh my God, Julian. I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea. I watched my older brother, the golden child, completely break down in my living room. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel jealous of him. I felt profound pity. We were both victims of the exact same toxic system. I was the scapegoat they openly abused, and he was the shiny trophy they manipulated and lied to. I know you didn't, I said softly, closing the laptop. But the lies didn't stop there. Christian stayed in my apartment for hours. Once he finally calmed down, I handed him the detailed background report Carter's investigator had compiled. I watched as Christian read through the agonizing reality of our family's financial ruin. Dad didn't just miss a promotion, Christian read aloud, his voice hollow. He was fired for gambling. The house is mortgaged to the absolute limit. There is no inheritance. It is all completely gone. He owes nearly $100,000 to people you do not want to owe money to, I added, leaning against the kitchen counter. Aunt Sarah confirmed it with my investigator last week. She has known about his gambling addiction for years, but she was too terrified of his temper to warn anyone. Christian looked up from the terrifying report. That is why he begged me to look into your company. He wasn't worried about you facing legal proceedings. He wanted to know how much money you had. He was using me to appraise his next target. Before I could respond, my cell phone buzzed violently on the kitchen island. I looked down. It was an email notification. The sender name was Richard Smith, my father. I opened the email. The subject line simply read, "Family obligations." I read the text in silence, my blood running completely cold. Then, without a word, I handed the phone to Christian. Christian read the email, his eyes widening with pure, unadulterated horror. Julian, we are in a very difficult financial situation, the email began. As our son, you have a strict moral and legal obligation to provide elder care assistance. We know about your company. We know exactly what it is worth. We are formally requesting $80,000 to resolve our immediate pressing debts. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in us pursuing all available legal remedies against you. This includes a massive public disclosure to your new corporate buyers regarding your complete abandonment of your family, and filing a formal elder neglect complaint with state authorities. Do the right thing. Christian dropped the phone onto the counter as if it had physically burned him. This is textbook extortion. This is a felony. They are literally threatening to sabotage your corporate merger if you don't pay their gambling debts. I looked at the glowing screen. A part of me, the deeply buried, incredibly damaged part of the 16-year-old boy who just wanted his father to be proud of his science fair project, felt a sharp, agonizing pang of grief. It was the final, undeniable proof that my parents saw me as nothing more than an ATM machine. Any lingering illusion of family was permanently dead. I took a slow, deep breath and let that grief wash away, replacing it with cold, hard steel. They want to play legal games, I said, picking up the phone and forwarding the extortion email directly to Carter. Fine, but I am not an 8-year-old kid anymore, and I am not playing by their rigged rules. I am shutting this down permanently. My parents did not waste any time. When 48 hours passed and I completely ignored their extortion email, they followed through on their vicious threat. They officially filed a fabricated elder neglect complaint with the Adult Protective Services Agency in Pennsylvania, claiming I had ruthlessly abandoned them in severe medical distress while hoarding millions of dollars. The following morning, an official social worker named Olivia called my cell phone. She sounded incredibly stern, reciting case numbers and state statutes regarding the legal abandonment of vulnerable adults. I didn't panic. I simply sat at my desk and calmly forwarded her the entire insurance folder. I sent her the bank transfer proving they stole $15,000 from me. I sent the screenshots showing they had blocked my number for 7 years. And most importantly, I sent her the extortion email they had written just 2 days prior, explicitly demanding $80,000 in exchange for dropping their threats. Olivia called me back less than 2 hours later. Her stern tone had completely vanished, replaced by a highly professional, incredibly apologetic demeanor. "Mr. Hayes," Olivia said, "I have thoroughly reviewed the documentation you provided. I am officially closing this case immediately. The complainants are clearly attempting to aggressively misuse the state protective system for financial leverage and blackmail. There is absolutely zero evidence of neglect here. I am so terribly sorry for the disruption to your day. That was strike one. But I wasn't going to just sit back and wait for them to throw strike two. I called Carter and told him to unleash hell." Carter spent 3 straight days drafting the most devastating, airtight legal response I had ever seen. It was a terrifying 47-page document. It meticulously detailed the fake medical emergency and wire fraud from 2018. It included a timeline of their prolonged harassment, ending with the recent extortion email. It clearly cited the specific state and federal statutes regarding wire fraud, blackmail, and filing false reports with a government agency. The document ended with a brutal, uncompromising cease and desist order. It explicitly stated that any further contact with me, my employees, or the Cascade Media Group executives would result in the immediate filing of severe criminal extortion charges with the district attorney's office, alongside a massive civil lawsuit for emotional distress and attempted tortious interference with my corporate merger. Carter didn't just send it via regular mail. He sent it via certified overnight courier directly to their house, requiring a physical signature. He wanted them to feel the absolute weight of the legal bomb that had just been dropped directly onto their dining room table. We gave them exactly 72 hours to formally withdraw all their demands and confirm in writing that they would never, ever contact me again. Instead of going quiet and hiring a lawyer to save themselves, my parents panicked. They somehow convinced themselves that if they could just get me in a room, they could guilt-trip me into backing down. They aggressively texted Christian, begging him to arrange a peaceful family reconciliation, meeting at a neutral coffee shop back in Lancaster. They promised they just wanted to apologize and clear the air. Christian called me utterly disgusted. "Don't go," he warned. "It is a trap. They just want to manipulate you in person." "No," I said, packing a small overnight bag. "I am going, and you are coming with me. It is time to look them in the eye and finish this." We met at a quiet, independent coffee shop on Main Street in Lancaster. Christian and I arrived early. We sat at a corner table. I placed 2 separate cell phones face up on the table, both with the red recording light visibly blinking. My parents walked in 15 minutes late. My mother's eyes were visibly red, acting as if she had been crying for days. My father's hands were physically shaking, but he tried to maintain his usual arrogant posture. They sat down across from us. "Julian, sweetheart," my mother started, her voice quivering perfectly. "We have been so incredibly worried about you. This whole legal misunderstanding has been so hard on the family." "Stop," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a razor blade. The young barista, Chloe, wiping down the counter nearby, paused and looked over nervously. I pointed to the blinking phones. "I am going to say this exactly once, and it is entirely on the record. In March of 2018, you called me. You completely fabricated a story about Christian facing severe legal proceedings. You told me he was going to federal prison. You stole $15,000 from me, and then you completely erased me from your lives." My father's face went from pale to a deep, angry red. "That money was a family loan. Families borrow from each other. It is not stealing." "You lied about me going to prison," Christian interjected, his voice surprisingly steady and filled with absolute venom. "I saw the bank records. You used my name, my reputation, to con my brother out of his life savings to pay off your illegal gambling debts. You disgust me." My mother gasped, real tears finally spilling over. "Christian, How can you side with him? We are your parents. We gave you everything. You gave me a fake inheritance and a lifetime of lies, Christian shot back. I slid a thick, printed copy of Carter's 47-page legal document across the small table. It landed with a heavy thud right in front of my father. You demanded $80,000 to keep quiet, I said, staring directly into my father's panicked eyes. That is a felony extortion charge. The paperwork is done. The district attorney is one phone call away. You have until Monday morning to sign the surrender agreement Carter sent you. If you ever contact me, Christian, or my business partners again, I will personally make sure you spend your retirement in a state penitentiary. I stood up, grabbing my coat. Christian stood up right beside me. We didn't wait for their response. We turned our backs and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving them sitting there in stunned, terrified silence, staring at the physical manifestation of their complete and utter ruin. The weekend passed in a state of tense, hypervigilant waiting. I flew back to Portland and sat in my apartment, watching the clock tick closer to the Monday morning deadline. A small, anxious part of my brain worried that my father's massive ego would override his common sense, that he would do something incredibly stupid and force me to actually pull the trigger on the criminal charges. I didn't want to send my parents to prison, but I was fully prepared to do whatever it took to protect the peace I had built. Monday morning arrived. At exactly 9:15, my phone buzzed with an incoming email notification. It was an email forwarded from Carter. The original sender was Nathan, a cheap local attorney my parents had clearly scrambled to hire over the weekend. The subject line read, "Cease and desist, Smith matter." I opened the email, my heart pounding in my chest. Please formally confirm receipt of this message and your acceptance of the outlined terms. Nathan's email read, my clients, Richard and Margaret Smith, completely agree to immediately cease any and all contact with Mr. Julian Hayes, his brother Christian, and any associated business entities. They formally withdraw any and all financial claims or complaints. My clients request absolute privacy and deeply wish to resolve this unfortunate matter without any further legal escalation. Below Nathan's formal legal jargon, Carter had added a brief, deeply satisfying personal note. They completely caved. They are terrified. It is officially over, Julian. Congratulations on getting your life back. I read the email 3 separate times, making sure I wasn't hallucinating the words on the screen. The massive, suffocating weight that had been sitting squarely on my chest for the last 7 years slowly began to lift. I closed my laptop, walked over to the large windows overlooking the river, and finally, for the very first time since that humiliating graduation dinner, I broke down and cried. They weren't tears of sadness. They weren't tears of grief or longing for a family I never truly had. They were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. The invisible chains had been permanently shattered. The terrifying ghosts of my past had been officially legally banished. I had faced the monsters under the bed, turned on the bright lights, and watched them scurry away into the dark. I was finally truly safe. 3 weeks later, the Cascade Media Group acquisition was finalized. The endless due diligence process concluded without a single issue. The massive corporate lawyers signed the final thick stacks of paperwork, and the official transfer of ownership was complete. I sat at my desk and opened my banking app. I watched the small loading circle spin for 2 seconds before the screen refreshed. The available cash balance sitting in my primary account read exactly $6.5 million. I stared at the staggering number for a very long time. I remembered the heavy glass mason jar hidden under the winter coats in my childhood closet. I remembered the freezing nights eating cheap ramen noodles in Seattle, terrified that an unexpected $50 expense would render me completely homeless. I remembered the sickening feeling of having exactly $400 to my name after saving Christian from a phantom prison sentence. I picked up my phone and texted Christian. The ink is dry. The deal officially closed. He replied almost immediately, "How do you feel?" I typed back, "Rich, and incredibly tired. But mostly, just tired." "You earned every single cent of it, Julian," Christian texted back. "Enjoy the quiet. That evening, the Portland sky finally cleared up, revealing a breathtaking sunset over the distant mountains. I left my penthouse, walked down to a ridiculously expensive, incredibly exclusive steakhouse in the city center, and asked for a table for one. I ordered the absolute most expensive cut of meat on the menu, a vintage glass of wine I couldn't even pronounce, and ate my dinner in complete, wonderful silence. When the waiter brought the heavy leather billfold, I paid with my corporate card and left a 50% cash tip on the table. I walked the 2 miles back to my apartment under the glowing streetlights. The air felt crisp and clean. I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder anymore. The money in my bank account was no longer just a high score in a video game. It was an impenetrable shield. It was the ultimate guarantee that I would never, ever have to rely on the toxic charity of another human being for as long as I lived. The following weekend, Christian booked a flight and came to visit me in Portland. It was his first real vacation in years. We didn't talk about our parents. We didn't talk about the ugly legal threats or the massive gambling debts. We just walked around the city, drank too much expensive coffee, and talked about the future. For the very first time in my 30 years of existence, I felt like I actually had a brother. On his last morning before heading to the airport, we sat in my living room, looking out at the river. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. I handed it to him. "What is this?" Christian asked, looking confused. "Open it," I said. He broke the seal and pulled out a cashier's check. It was made out to him in the exact amount of $15,000. Christian's eyes widened, and he immediately tried to hand it back. "Julian, absolutely not. I am not taking your money. You earned this. I don't need charity." "It is not charity, Christian," I said, holding up my hand to stop him. "And it is not a gift. It is a closing of a chapter." He looked down at the check, his hands trembling slightly. 7 years ago, they maliciously used your good name and your reputation to steal from me, I explained gently. They turned you into a weapon to hurt me. I am giving this back to you because it was never about the money in the first place. It was about trust. I am using my name and my money to finally end the cycle. I want you to take it. Pay off a student loan, take a vacation, donate it to a charity, I don't care. Just do something good with it. Reclaim your name. Christian stared at the piece of paper. The heavy weight of the last few months, the profound betrayal by the parents who had worshipped him, finally seemed to settle. He carefully folded the check and placed it in his wallet. Then he leaned over and hugged me. It wasn't the awkward, polite, distant hug we were forced to give each other during family holidays when we were kids. It was a real, fiercely tight embrace between two men who had survived a war they never asked to fight in. "I am so sorry I wasn't a better brother to you when we were growing up," Christian whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am sorry I was so blind." "You are here right now," I said, patting him on the back. "And honestly, that is more than enough. It is December now. The year 2025 is rapidly drawing to a close. The heavy winter rain is falling steadily outside my penthouse windows, blurring the bright city lights of Portland into soft, glowing halos. I am sitting in my comfortable leather chair, sipping a glass of water, and reflecting on the incredible, chaotic journey of the last 7 years. I haven't heard a single word from my parents in over 5 weeks. There have been no desperate phone calls from unknown numbers, no manipulative emails, no cheap private investigators knocking on my employees' doors. Carter assures me that the legal threat terrified them into permanent submission. I honestly don't think I will ever hear from them again. And the beautiful truth is, I am completely, entirely okay with that. Sometimes my mind drifts back to that painfully humiliating afternoon on May 13th, 2017. I think about my father standing in that crowded Italian restaurant, holding his wine glass, looking down his nose at me while 60 people laughed at his cruel joke. I vividly remember the exact tone of his voice when he confidently told me that maybe, one day, I would finally find something I was actually good at. It took me 7 incredibly difficult, agonizing years, but he was absolutely right. I did find something I was good at. Turns out, I am incredibly good at building a beautiful, successful life entirely without them. I am exceptionally good at taking deep, traumatic pain and fiercely channeling it into an undeniable, unstoppable purpose. And above all else, I am really good at recognizing my own inherent worth, even when the people who were supposed to love me the most refused to see it. They desperately wanted me to disappear into the shadows so they wouldn't have to look at their own failures. I did exactly what they wanted. I disappeared, but I didn't fade away into nothingness. I used the dark to quietly build an empire. I am 30 years old. I run a highly successful media company worth millions of dollars. I have a brother who finally, truly sees me for who I am. The heavy silence that used to absolutely terrify me when I first arrived in the city now sounds like the sweetest, most peaceful music in the world. They demanded that I find something I was good at. Well, I found it. I am good at being completely, unapologetically free. And looking out at the city I conquered, knowing they are trapped in the miserable, bankrupt prison of their own making, I realize something profound. Total, absolute freedom isn't just the best revenge. It is the only revenge that actually matters.